I am absolutely thrilled to share this one with you today because we're going to dive into a seriously mind-bending biological mystery. It's one that connects your own everyday anatomy to deep, ancient evolutionary survival. Seriously, have you ever stopped to think about how your body is built compared to some of the most extreme, wild shapes out there in the animal kingdom? Well, today we're unpacking exactly why humans are built the way we are and why evolution, despite all its magic, sometimes hits a completely invisible, unbreakable wall.
All right, let's kick things off with a magic number, 7. It is both true and honestly wildly fascinating that whether you're a human sitting here listening to this, a gray wolf hunting out in the forest, or a massive giraffe reaching for the highest leaves on an acacia tree, we all have exactly 7 neck bones. No more, no less. But the reason why? It is utterly bizarre. It isn't just some random cosmic coincidence. It's an epic story involving millions of years of evolution, the mechanics of how you breathe, and, surprisingly enough, cancer.
So, to really wrap our heads around this, we first need to look at the baseline blueprint of the mammalian spine. We can break it down into 4 main sections. First, we've got our cervical vertebrae up in the neck. Those are our 7 special bones. Then, moving down the spine, we hit 12 thoracic vertebrae in the upper and mid-back, 5 lumbar vertebrae in the lower back, and finally, 5 sacral vertebrae fused together right at the pelvis. Okay, technically there's a tiny vestigial tailbone in there too, but we can totally ignore that for our structural blueprint. This right here, this is your standard mammal setup.
Now, contrast us mammals with reptiles. These guys are basically the Wild West of spines. Reptiles will drastically alter their bone counts just to survive and change their body shapes. A 2011 analysis showed that when evolutionary pressure demands a new body shape, reptiles absolutely deliver. A tiny dwarf chameleon, for example, might have just 14 total vertebrae in its whole body. Meanwhile, a snake can boast anywhere from 136 to well over 290 vertebrae. And snakes actually de-regionalize them. They don't even bother with strict lumbar versus thoracic categories. They just make it work.
And amphibians? Oh, they take this flexibility to a whole other level. For most of the animal kingdom outside of mammals, it is incredibly easy to play around with bone counts. Take some salamanders that spend their whole lives in the water. They have massive vertebral variation. In fact, some salamander populations can alter their total number of vertebrae based solely on the temperature their egg is exposed to while developing. Think about that. Just a change in temperature and boom, different skeleton. They are just incredibly flexible.
But then, you look at us mammals. We are total sticklers for the rules. We almost always max out at exactly 26 to 27 total spinal bones across the board. That usually breaks down to our 7 cervical neck bones and between 19 to 20 thoracic and lumbar bones combined. We absolutely do not do the extreme, wild variations you see in snakes or salamanders.
Now sure, every rule has its oddballs. We do occasionally see weird, isolated mutants out there. For instance, and here is your pop culture trivia fact of the day, the singer Adele actually has a 6th lumbar vertebrae down in her lower back. But having a single individual human with a random mutation is one thing. Passing it down over generations so that a permanently altered brand new species emerges, that is incredibly rare for mammals.
What's really brilliant here is that when mammals do actually evolve their spines, they usually just swap a bone's job rather than adding brand new ones from scratch. Take our close relatives, the chimps. We both have the exact same total number of vertebrae, but where humans have 12 thoracic and 5 lumbar bones, chimps have 13 thoracic and only 4 lumbar. They didn't invent a new bone out of nowhere. Evolution just cleverly reassigned an existing one to a different region.
However, when we look specifically at the neck, the rules get so much stricter. In fact, out of thousands and thousands of living mammal species, evolutionary history only allowed a change in neck bone count 3 isolated times. You've got manatees, which usually have 6, you've got 2-toed sloths, which can have as few as 5, and 3-toed sloths, which can have up to 10. Just to put how incredibly rare that is into perspective, vertebrates evolved powered flight 3 separate times. That literally means it is somehow easier for animals to learn how to fly than it is for a mammal to add or subtract a single neck bone. Crazy, right?
So, what's the holdup? Well, the secret to this extreme anatomical stubbornness lies deep within our genes, specifically a group called our Hox genes. You can think of these as the fundamental cellular blueprint for building our bodies. They're the master genes that tell an undifferentiated ball of embryonic cells exactly how and where to form all your vital subunits. If you want to change how many neck bones you have, you absolutely have to tweak these Hox genes. There's no way around it. Which brings us to the absolute core of today's mystery. Imagine you're an early giraffe, and you desperately need a longer neck to reach that higher food. What deadly evolutionary wall is stopping you from just mutating your Hox genes to add an 8th or a 9th neck bone? Why do giraffes have to stretch out their 7 existing bones into these massive elongated shapes, while birds can just safely add more bones whenever they want?
Well, the terrifying answer, and the massive plot twist to this whole thing, is cancer. The reality is that making tweaks to these specific Hox genes in mammals is heavily tied to deadly illnesses. Because it turns out, the very mechanism that dictates our spinal structure is deeply physically linked to the mechanisms that keep our cellular growth in check.
To put this into perspective, let's look at the work of researcher Friedson Gallus. When she investigated why we're stuck with 7 neck bones, she looked at children who naturally developed what's called a cervical rib. Basically, it's a tiny mutant rib growing right out of that 7th neck bone, and it's a clear telltale sign of a Hox gene mutation. What she found was incredibly stark. In a study of over 1,000 children, 21.8% of the kids with malignant tumors had this rib abnormality. Compare that to just 5.5% of children without tumors. And for certain cancers, like neuroblastoma, that mutation rate jumped to a staggering 33%.
And actually, if we look even earlier at fetal development, a later study showed just how deadly this mutation is before birth. Gallus and her team looked at miscarriages and stillborn infants. For those with no other visible abnormalities, around 30% had at least one mutant cervical rib, and for infants who had multiple major abnormalities, that rate skyrocketed to over 60%. So it's clear this mutation causes an alarming spike in early mortality.
To really grasp how ruthless this evolutionary filter is, you just have to look at the adults who actually survive. A massive, sweeping study analyzed over 4 million adult X-rays. The result? A mere 0.2% of surviving adults had this cervical rib mutation. That's practically zero. It tells us that if your Hox genes mutate to change your neck vertebrae, the association with fatal outcomes is so incredibly strong that the trait is almost never passed down to the next generation.
But let's say a mammal miraculously survives that cancer risk. Well, they aren't out of the woods yet, because there are grave mechanical consequences too. Surviving with this mutation often leads to something called thoracic outlet syndrome. This is a debilitating degenerative condition where the nerves in your neck and shoulder get severely compressed. We're talking about something that severely limits your ability to even use your arms. So tweaking the neck bones isn't just deadly on a cellular level, it's highly detrimental physically too.
So is it just cancer and pinched nerves? Nope. There's another huge piece to this puzzle, holding our neck bone count hostage. We mammals are also locked into our 7 neck bones because of how we manage the single most critical function of all, breathing.
It's all about the diaphragm, that crucial muscle sitting right below our lungs. During early fetal development, your diaphragm goes on quite the journey. The cells that will eventually become your diaphragm actually originate way up at the cervical spine. Yeah, in your neck. As you develop in the womb, they migrate down into your chest, stretching and dragging the connected nerves all the way from your neck down to the diaphragm. So you can imagine, messing with the neck vertebrae risks pinching or compressing that absolutely vital, life-saving nerve.
Actually, do me a favor. Right now, put your hands on the bottom of your rib cage and just take a deep breath in. Go ahead. You should feel the bottom of your rib cage expanding outwards. That is happening because your diaphragm anchors exactly at the border of your movable ribs, pulling down to effectively vacuum air into your lungs. Its precise, exact placement in your chest is absolutely critical to getting a deep breath.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. What about those 3 rule breakers we talked about earlier? How on earth do sloths and manatees cheat death? Well, it turns out they possess unusually long rib cages, which means their diaphragms don't anchor on the exact same spot ours do. They literally bypass the breathing risk. And as for that scary cancer risk, sloths and manatees have incredibly sluggish, low metabolic rates. A slower metabolism produces fewer free radicals, which means far less DNA damage. This potentially allows them to survive these Hox gene mutations without developing rampant cancer. They found a loophole. And boom, that completely solves our mystery from earlier. Why birds and reptiles can mutate their spines into these bizarre extreme shapes while we can't. Look at the diaphragm divide. Mammals must fiercely protect their delicate diaphragm nerve connections. But birds, reptiles, and amphibians? They don't even have diaphragms. Birds use air sacs, reptiles manually expand their ribs. Without a diaphragm to accidentally paralyze, their neck bones are completely free to mutate.
So the next time you're looking at a towering giraffe stretching all the way up to the treetops, remember the invisible constraints of biology. We are both sticking our necks out within the exact same evolutionary cage, bound by cancer risks and the simple everyday mechanics of drawing a breath.
Are we ultimately trapped by the very mechanisms that kept our ancient ancestors alive? It's a pretty striking reminder of just how interconnected every single part of our biology truly is. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. And hey, keep questioning how the incredible world around you is put together.